The day after Joe Rogan had Jordan Peterson on, who's basically presenting a gospel without the person of Jesus Christ, he then has Alan Graham on, who is doing his best to live out the gospel of Christ to the people he serves. I don't think that's a coincidence.
Began to really explore my Catholic faith. And through that process, I just got enamored with the church. And when I talk about the church, I'm talking about the whole thing: the Roman Catholic Church, the Eastern Church, the Protestant Church, the schisms, the heresy, the wars, the reformations. And I got enamored with maybe one of the greatest novels ever written in mankind. What a train wreck this whole deal is. Yet at the center of that deal remains this Jesus of Nazareth. And so that was very intellectual for me. And I was buying into it. My faith was buying into it. I was believing in it. I wanted to believe into it, but I had no factual things to take me there. This retreat took that intellectual stuff and dropped it afloor right into the depths of my heart. And that's where the change really began to occur. It became more of a heart relationship with Christ as opposed to a intellectual thing.
So when you talk about these specific concepts that are hard for people to wrap their heads around, like the resurrection, what do you do with that in your mind when you say you have an intellectual relationship with it? When you come across something that seems impossible, how do you manage that in your mind? Like, how do you approach it?
Well, look, I think there are just some things in the world that you just have to be willing to accept. The immensity of the unknown, basically, and you and I live in a universe of the unknown. We would all agree, and I think science would agree, that there are things that we know, but it's probably extraordinarily limited. Obviously, much more than we knew 500 or 600 years ago.
Right.
But today, you and I live in a world basically where we're having to accept things for the most part that we can't.
I really like Alan's perspective. He's talking about the whole church, not just the Roman Catholic Church, Protestant, Orthodox, and in the midst of that acknowledges kind of the failure, that the church is not a perfect place. It's filled with imperfect people. And yet through that, there is this person of Christ at the center, holding that community of faith together. I really, really like that perspective. It's something that's come up on the podcast before. And then they sort of go into this question of the intellectual side of faith, which is very Joe Rogan, if you've followed any of his kind of faith journey up until this point. He's had really good questions, and I'll come back to this, but I think Joe Rogan is he's the good kind of skeptic. And yet there's always been this hiccup with him of like the things that you can't really explain: the virgin birth, the resurrection of Jesus, the Trinity. There are these intellectual obstacles that do seem to maybe get in Joe Rogan's way, as they do for all of us. I mean, I can testify to that as well. But then it's ultimately the people who come into your life who embody the person of Christ that you kind of go, man, there is something to this. Does that mean that all of your intellectual questions have to be answered before you can believe in that person of Christ? I don't think so. Now, I think the Bible welcomes these types of questions and this type of wrestling, but ultimately there's an invitation to the person of Christ and to trust in him and believe in him despite the presence of doubt, which is actually the next part of this conversation. So I think it really does kind of set the stage. Thank you for being here with me as we carve through this conversation and hopefully build on it and add to it and add to the what I think is a very meaningful conversation.
Do you believe that like God has created other life forms in other places?
I believe it's completely possible. You know, I'm cut out of the doubting Thomas. If you're familiar with the Apostle Thomas, I'm cut out of that cloth. There's a great image, and it's an image in our sanctuary in the village of a Caravaggio called The Incredulity of Thomas, and it's got Thomas sticking his finger into the wound of Jesus with what I believe are the Apostle Peter and Paul looking over the
there
top.
It is.
Yeah. And I speak in that. I have a talk that I give called the Gospel Con Carne, which is the gospel with meat. But that woundedness, I mean, Thomas, when the boys came to him after the resurrection and said Jesus is alive, he basically said, bullshit. I'm not going to believe it until I see the nail marks in his feet and stick my finger in his side. And this is the phenomenal depiction of that by Caravaggio. And Thomas, if you really look at it, look at his face, bro. Look at the grimaced forehead. His eyeballs can't even look at him putting his finger in that deal. And then he's got the torn garments like he's homeless. And then you look at, Christ's face. I don't know how you can paint that kind of compassion. And then his hand over the forearm of Thomas, guiding that finger in the most gentlest way. The boys looking over the top of that deal. And look, these are all fishermen, people, and I have no doubt in my mind that they're looking at that and going, WTF.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, because they were just guys. But at that moment, he uttered that he believes, my Lord, my God is what he said. And so, there's always the doubt in whether there's aliens or not. I don't know, but I would be an idiot to say I absolutely don't know.
I think Allan's perspective is really refreshing. And as I pointed out at the beginning, this podcast coming on the heels of Jordan Peterson's podcast, I think is so beautiful because Jordan Peterson presents this sort of, like I said, like sort of a gospel, but it's not really the gospel because there's no Christ in that gospel. It's this sort of very sophisticated, philosophical, I don't really understand Jordan Peterson to some degree. And then you have Allan Graham just come on and just be very honest and very open and very approachable with his take on faith. And that painting of Thomas I thought was really good, and it really does tie into the Jordan Peterson piece of this conversation because Jordan Peterson pointed out this sculpture from Michelangelo of Mary holding Jesus after his death, and it does speak to you. And art has a way of speaking to you in a form that gets past some of the kind of the intellectual obstacles that maybe we were talking about. It's like we're really trying to describe something that's kind of indescribable, and language can help us, and we need to have these conversations, but art can take us into kind of the next level. So it's interesting that Jordan Peterson draws from a sculpture to try to describe what he's talking about, and then Allan draws from this painting to describe what he is talking about. And so again, the two conversations play with each other, which again, I've got this working theory about podcasting and kind of dialogue happening in this podcast space that I find fascinating. And now that I've started to think about it, I see it quite often, like with Jordan Peterson and Allan Graham both being on Joe Rogan. Now, the purpose of doubt, I think, and this, we could go into this, I think I've done other podcasts on this particular passage with Thomas, but there is a transformation that happens. So you pick up the story of Thomas in John chapter 20. Thomas, who's one of the 12, Didymus, he's a twin. They're saying they saw Christ, they saw him. That's key. And Thomas says, unless I see his hands and the imprint of the nails, and I put my fingers into the place of the nails, and I put my hand into his side, I will not believe. Remember how I said that Joe Rogan, I think, is the right kind of skeptic? I think Thomas gets a bad rap often as maybe in the church as we preach on this passage. I don't think Jesus is reprimanding Thomas when he encounters Thomas later, right? 8 days later, the disciples were again together, and Jesus said to Thomas, he doesn't say, Thomas, come on, get with the program, man. Jesus invites Thomas to proceed through his doubt and come into contact with the person of Christ. That, I think, is what happens to us all. That, I think, is what might happen for a person like Joe Rogan. And the reason that I think it's important is because I do think we're witnessing sort of a phenomenon going on in culture today. I think that this is happening on a large scale, and I think we're seeing it in a place like Joe Rogan or Russel Brand. Reach here with your fingers and see my hands, and reach here and put your hand into my side. There's a point at which we come into contact with the person of Christ, the true person of Christ. Jordan Peterson couldn't point you to that. Alan Graham does. And do not be unbelieving, but believing. And a lot of people, they will give Thomas a bad rap because this can also be translated stop doubting. Now, I think that that's a bad translation. I think that the NASB has it right here. Be not unbelieving, but believing. Be not an unbeliever, but a believer. There's a transformation that happens in Thomas's life when he comes into contact with the person of Christ. We cannot overlook this. It's beautiful. I mean, it's amazing. And Thomas answered and said, my Lord and my God. So there you have it. There's a foreshadowing of this, actually, I think, in the book of Job, where Job says, I had heard about you with the hearing of my ear, but now my eyes see you, and I repent, I retract with dust and ashes. It's a beautiful, transformative experience that we have. That the Christian gospel invites us into it, even with doubt. It's not like you have to figure it all out and then become a believer. You have to come into contact with the person of Christ, which I believe is possible. That's maybe the difference between someone like Alan Graham, who then lives out the gospel, and someone like Jordan Peterson, who kind of portrays a utilitarian gospel that's sort of disembodied from the person of Christ. So I just thought that was a beautiful moment in their conversation when they start to talk about this.
Do you approach religion with that same line of thinking?
I approach religion from a faith level. I was raised, my mom, when she went into a mental hospital when I was 4 years old, spent a year there, subjected to the most powerful psychotropic drugs known to man, electric shock therapy, the whole deal. My dad files for a divorce during that period of time, attempts to strip my mother of her maternal rights of her 4 boys. My mom wins all that because she had great parents. She gets out, and at some point in time, she converts to Roman Catholicism and drags me and my brothers to church and the whole deal. I was 4 or 5, so I don't have much memory of that, but I have a lot of memory of the love that my mother had for Christ and Mary. And when you're in love with somebody that has profound behavioral health issues like my mom had, and you see that Christ and his mother, Mary, brought tremendous relief to my mom, that has an impact on you. So I go into this with faith. Complete faith. And I'm just released of trying to figure out, is it right or is it wrong? And I'm
Right.
released of having to prove to people. I don't get into apologetic arguments with people. This is just who I am and how I express who I am.
That is one of the more fascinating things about people that are very religious, is that whether or not you think they're correct or not, it obviously has a profound effect on them. And then this release, like you're discussing, is obviously hugely beneficial to people and to communities, and it motivates people to do beautiful things like what you've done.
So now you have the story of a transformed mother, right? So and all throughout this conversation, Allan is going to bring us back to people and to the embodiment, I think, of the gospel. And you hear that in the story of his mom. Real struggle, real pain, real trial, and true transformation. Why? Because she came into contact with the person of Christ. I don't know how, of course you don't argue with that. That's not something you sort of, I do think maybe in the background, Joe or people like Joe might be going, okay, is this real? Is this really real? And so you kind of have to see it for yourself in some ways. I think that is true. that I have suspected that that is true since Adam Curry came on Joe's podcast and talked about his testimony of Christ, because that story that Allan just gave is more than a story. It's a testimony. And there's a reason Scripture says that the testimony of believers is powerful. In fact, the gates of hell cannot withstand the blood of the Lamb and the testimony of the church. There's a reason for that. It's a powerful thing when you not only talk about someone being transformed, but you have witnessed their transformation. And so for people like Joe, and I know we're sort of using Joe Rogan's podcast as sort of an example of what's going on more broadly in culture, like a barometer of what's going on in culture. So Joe, or people like Joe, would have to see someone like a friend like Adam Curry go from what Adam Curry was to who he is now, or Rampage Jackson. If you go back to one of the other episodes, it's like, wow, something happened to Rampage Jackson after he came into contact with Christ. Something happened to Adam Curry after he came into contact with Christ. I mean, Hulk Hogan even went on Joe Rogan and talked about his baptism and stuff like that. So Joe, and people like Joe, I think are surrounded by these sort of testimonies of true transformation. And I do, again, love that this is being talked about. I do appreciate the skepticism of people like Joe Rogan, because what it does for the believer is it leaves you with this question: is the life that you're living consistent with the gospel that you are preaching? And that is convicting for me. This whole episode is convicting for me, and it should be, like, in a good way. Like, that is surgery, that's transformation, that's restoration that is going on. And so I love it. I mean, the love of a mother who's got deeply troubled yet finds Jesus. That's my testimony. That's how I approach faith. Does it satisfy me intellectually? Sure, but it satisfies on a deeper level, in a very, like, I can live this out kind of way.
You know, look, if God is the creator, he's created all this. So when I tell people all the time, that want to get into a different argument about this or that or the other, I just go, look, man, God created all this. He's going to have to sort all the bullshit out. I'm not the sorter outer. But this is how I'm going to live my life to the best that I possibly can, which is simple. Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. So that's what we're going to do.
Yeah, and it's a beautiful way to live. It really is. And it's interesting that some people would dismiss it and even dismiss the beauty of it because they're opposed to the idea of it being attached to religion.
Well, if you look at what we humans have done in the name of religion, or even non-religion, over the course of our entire history here on Earth, we've screwed the pooch.
Yeah. We've also made a lot of great advances.
Tremendous advances.
We have penicillin now.
Huh?
So we have penicillin now.
Oh, yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like, yeah, we have ruined a lot of things, but you would not want to be alive 5,000 years ago. It would have been fucking barbaric.
Again, Allan's perspective is just so refreshing. I'm not the sorter outer of all the BS. Like, yeah, and again, we're staring straight at the BS. Like, as sort of like honest followers of Jesus. And again, I sort of come at this from a biblical Christian worldview. Sorry, I didn't say that earlier. You got me. We don't ignore the BS, and I think that's been a problem. Historic, like maybe in the last, I don't know, let's just say 100 years or so, we're sitting in this sort of like post-Enlightenment industrial revolution, and the fault of the church, I think, has kind of been that come to Jesus and he'll make all things better. True, like fundamentally true, and yet it's really the cross and the empty tomb. I mean, Jesus, when he's talking to his followers on the way to Emmaus, he said, "Did you not know that the Son of Man must suffer these things and enter into his glory?" He never overlooks the suffering part of the gospel. Suffering precedes glory, and we embody that. We live that out. And so to sort of acknowledge both that, I'm not the sorter outer of all the BS. The BS is real, but God has it. God is the sorter outer of the BS. And then to just like acknowledge that there is sort of like a fundamental problem with humanity. We have really messed things up. There's like human depravity there's a very real problem, and it requires a very real solution. I thought actually this was kind of like a sort of a rare L for Joe Rogan when he says you wouldn't want to live, back in sort of, a couple thousand years ago because it was just barbaric. Like, is it any less barbaric today? Like, we have human trafficking. I can't even talk about what's happening to children right now. There's political chaos. I mean, are we better? Is it less barbaric today in the modern world than it was thousands of years ago? I don't think so. I can't imagine. Like, if anything, we've gotten worse. And so human depravity there, they didn't say those words, but that's really what they're talking about. Then, sort of brings us back to Jesus. We need a real solution here for a very real problem.
Look, I just got back. Last year I walked the Camino de Santiago. I'm going back in September.
What is that?
That's a pilgrimage. Today, in a funny way, is and almost providential, is the feast of St. James the Apostle. And it is believed that the bones of St. James the Apostle are buried in Santiago de Compostela, Spain. For over 1,000 years, there have been these pilgrimages, and 500,000 people will do that pilgrimage this year, walking along a 500-mile journey, which I did last year, and I'm going back in September to do another 300 miles, along one of the most medieval journeys on the planet, going from one little small medieval Spanish town, another, until you get to Santiago, where the bones of the apostle are buried. And so it's a pilgrimage. It's one of the three great pilgrimages: pilgrimage to Rome, pilgrimage to Mecca.
How long does it take?
Well, if you try to do the whole 500, 6 weeks. It can be done faster if you're in Joe Rogan shape. Yeah, if you're in Allan Graham shape, we're gonna take a little time. But you really want to saunter through the deal as opposed to power.
Right.
Power through it.
And just taking the experience.
Although people from all walks of life walk this deal, it's a very Roman Catholic deal because all the churches in all these small towns are Roman Catholic churches, and it goes back in the medieval time when when the Crusades were going down and there was the battle between the Christians and the Saracens, and all that. It's just it's a magnificent experience.
So what's Allan's solution? I love that he goes and tells a story about his pilgrimage. And he says a key word that I want to talk about a little bit, because Henry David Thoreau gives this great quote about what it means to saunter. Allan says, you really don't want to go at breakneck pace when you go on this pilgrimage, when you go on any kind of spiritual quest. And again, as a barometer for where we are in culture, I think a lot of people are on a spiritual quest. They're trying to find answers, and you could be frantic, and you could be frenetic, and you could be freaked out, or you could go on a pilgrimage. You could saunter. Listen to what Henry David Thoreau, this is from The Art of Walking, because when you're a sort of a poet like Henry David Thoreau, you can write about such things, the art of walking. I have met with but one or two persons in the course of my life who understood the art of walking, that is, of taking walks, who had a genius, so to speak, for sauntering, which word is beautifully derived from idle people who roved about the country in the Middle Ages and asked charity under the pretense of going à la Sainte Thierry, to the Holy Land. The Holy Land. Little children exclaimed, there goes a saunterer, a holy lander, a person walking to the Holy Land, a saunterer, the Holy Land. He'll go on and actually talk about how it can also be kind of derived from this idea that you have no home, that your home is everywhere, which I think is interesting because of what Allan Graham does. He provides a home for the homeless. That's his ministry. That's part of his ministry. That's part of how he embodies the gospel. And here you have this saunterer, this idea of holy journey, holy walking. He even says life is a camino. Life is a journey. We are on this sort of spiritual quest. And I think that we can walk that road with a lot of hope. knowing that there is a land that we are promised, that there is a city whose builder and architect is God. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for the conviction of things not seen, for by it men of old gain approval. By faith, this whole conversation with Joe Rogan and Allan, in a sense, has been about faith. What is it? What kind of faith do you have? The type of faith that is just intellectual, or is it just the type of faith that is heart, or is it the type of faith that can satisfy both of those in the life that you live? By faith, we understand that the worlds were prepared by the word of God so that what is seen with our eyes was not made out of things which are visible. Going back to Joe's original question, what do you do with the stuff that's really hard to understand? The person of Christ, the virgin birth, the resurrection, the Trinity. Well, I have to understand that things which are seen are not even made out of that which is visible. So there's this unseen realm, to borrow from Heiser, that is actually more fundamental to reality than even what maybe my senses are telling me. And he goes on, for we're looking for a city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. For those who say such things, make it clear that they're not seeking a country of their own. And indeed, if they had been thinking of a country that they had come from, they would have had an opportunity to return to that country. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Why can we be holy wanderers, in a sense homeless, and yet journeying towards a true home? Hebrews 11 kind of gives us that framework, that there is a true city that we hunger for, that we long for, that we know is out there. So I think that is, again, I sort of went off on this whole thing just because Allan used the word saunter. So hopefully that's not too rambly. But again, it goes back to the question, what are we to do? What are we to do in a world that does look like it's sort of falling apart? Maybe even internally, I feel like I'm sort of falling apart. Well, maybe we need to have a lot of hope that our quest is not in vain, that we journey not without hope, but there's a great hope out there. What I think is interesting also about Allan's journey and what he continues to point to is that it's the people that you meet along the way that really do make that journey meaningful. And maybe even it's Christ in those people that you meet along the way that make that journey meaningful.
And when you do these things, what do you get out of that? Like, what does it do for you?
Well, last year, the purpose was to celebrate the 25th anniversary of Mobile Loaves and Fishes. And
congratulations on that.
Yeah,
by the way.
thank you, man. I appreciate
Very,
it.
very impressive.
You know, I'm going back in September, and I have two of my kids going with me. So it's going to be this great spiritual opportunity to journey. And then along the way, God brings into your life people from all walks of life. And you don't know the impact of people coming into your life. Like, I believe I'm sitting in this chair right now because of how God has architected us over a few years coming together, and now we're here. And so life is a camino, which means the way. And, you and I are on this journey, and lots of things come into our world that just kind of come out of, the ether, and appear. So why not create as many opportunities in our lives? Many people want to architect how things are going to go in their life, and they got to have it precise and planned and this. Mm-hmm. And this is a very unplanned, I don't know where we'll be sleeping on any given night. I don't know who we're going to encounter at any given night. I don't know what restaurant we're going to be in on any given night, or where we're going to eat a meal, or, who we're going to meet. And so there's a lot of providence that's in this journey, in this pilgrimage. It's cool. It's something that would blow a Joe Rogan away.
I'm sure.
Yeah, it's the people along the way. You have to sort of surrender to the journey. You have to surrender to the process. You can't control who might come in to your life and who might influence you. I just love that sort of Allan acknowledges that there's some providence at work in life, and if you truly understand God as like a loving father, then you can see that providence is ultimately reassuring. And I wonder, I mean, again, I've talked about the fact that, some people suspect, Joe is on a journey towards Christianity or something like that. I suspect the same thing, but I suspect that when Joe finds Jesus, if he hasn't already, that his faith will not fit into whatever sort of modern evangelical framework that we have. And I think that that's a good thing. I think that even to go back to something that Allan pointed out at the very beginning, something that I feel like I've seen even doing podcasting, is that the body of Christ is far more dynamic than just any one particular church congregation. We're all a part of this body. And I wonder if the faith of someone like a Joe Rogan wouldn't be a little bit more like a Camino, a little bit more like a journey, a little bit more like a mystical experience. And I do think, like, in a way, coming into contact with the person of Christ, I mean, I'm making this claim that a man who died 2,000 years ago and resurrected from the grave somehow entered into my life here now. I mean, if that's not sort of mystical on some level, I don't know what is. And I think that maybe is the point, is that there's a re-enchantment happening within the church that I think is actually quite healthy. And then we get to see what that looks like, because I know that we're sort of sitting here in a podcast, but Joe's going to point out that he sees something in Allan Graham. He sees something in a person who has come into contact with Jesus that I think is both encouraging and, again, kind of challenging for us, particularly for a person like me who likes to sit here and talk about these things. I mean, eventually you have to live it out.
It's always interesting to me when those moments do have, when someone enters your life, you meet someone, and you just go, I want to know more about the way you think. I want to know more about what you're doing. And the way you talked was with no ego and with kindness and with sincerity. And immediately I thought, I want to talk to that guy. I want to find out what's going on with him. There's people that you meet that are like extraordinarily peaceful and extraordinarily content. That's how you seem to me. And when you were on that stage talking, I was saying to my wife, we got to get his information. I want to get him on the podcast. I want to talk to him. I just want to find out what's going on with him. Because I think you're a very unusual person. Because there's a lot of people out there that profess to be Christians. They profess to be whatever their denomination is, whatever their religion is, but they don't necessarily live it. Like you abandoned your beautiful house and moved into one of these tiny homes in this homeless community. And then when we went and toured the community and got to see how you interact with everybody, it's beautiful. It's really very extraordinary. And I don't think there's very many people that would do that, what you've done. You live with them, you feed them, they have all these activities, different things to do, different ways to make a living. There's all these people that are extraordinary artists, and they're sort of trapped. And then you come along and you find great value in these people, and they find incredible value in this community that you've created. It's an example of someone who's actually doing it. You're actually living that life. You're actually contributing in an incredibly positive way to all those different human beings, the hundreds of different human beings that you encounter with this, and how much you've shaped and changed their lives. It's very beautiful. It really is.
Well, the interesting thing is that how they have shaped my life.
Man, I love this conversation. And of course, go check out the whole thing. There's stuff that I'm not able to cover just for the sake of time. But I just, again, I think that this is a witness to the transformative power of the person of Christ. Joe sees something in Allan. Allan sees something in the people that he's working with. I just love it's not, it's like, we look at it like, oh, here's this person who, has, whatever, wealth, or, he's got a home. He's fortunate in that the people who are on the streets, homeless, are unfortunate. Allan doesn't seem to have that perspective. He's like, what's really amazing is what they teach me. Blessed are the poor, theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Jesus said it's easier for a rich man to pass through the eye of a needle than to enter the kingdom. So like there is something that there's no arrogance in this, and I don't get the sense that Allan is doing this out of compulsion. The love of God is not pity, and so as we reflect the love of God on other people, it's not just like, oh man, I'm going to do this for these poor, unfortunate souls. It's like, no, I'm going to do this, one, because I just feel called by God to do this, to serve these people. And as I do, they teach me and they enrich my life. And there's a community. That's what I think is so beautiful about this, is if you embody the gospel of Christ, if you live your life as Jesus did, it seems that community is what is created. Healthy community. So you can look out now at the geopolitical chaos and whatever, and everybody's wondering, well, what do we do? What political solution do we have? Allan Graham has the political solution. He has a community. Is it perfect? Is it a perfect community? No, of course not. We're not perfect, but there's a promise in Scripture that Christ is making his church beautiful. He is shaping us into the image of Christ. And so, I think there's just something here, again, about Allan's approach to life. You see it in Acts when the apostles of Jesus, again, these guys are fishermen. They're not sophisticated. They're not well-trained. They didn't even get it. The whole time they were with Jesus, they really didn't get it. I think Luke's gospel portrays that in an interesting way. But here they are in Acts, also written by Luke. Now, as they observe, this is John and Peter before the courts. They've been brought in. They're being charged. They're like, stop preaching the gospel, and they're like, we can't stop. We can't. We have to share what we've seen, and then they kick them out. And that says, now as they observed the confidence of Peter and John and understood that they were uneducated and untrained men. This has been a theme as I look at Joe Rogan and as I look at what's going on in the world today. It seems that the foolish things of the world are confounding the wise, that there's an unveiling happening. There's revealing happening, and it's often the sort of the comics and the jokers and seemingly the foolish things of the world that confound the wise. Again, comparing this conversation between Joe and Allan with the conversation between Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson obviously has this very sophisticated approach to things, but I think ultimately misses. Allan has a very simple approach to life, and I think he gets it, right? They understood. Now, this council that Peter and John are standing before understood something about these men. They were amazed looking at them and began to recognize them as having been with Jesus. Do you notice that? They recognized something of Christ in these two followers of Jesus. That's the important. That's what Joe is talking about when he says, you come across somebody and they're displaying something of peace, of calm. I don't know what it is. I think it's Jesus. I think what Allan is showing Joe, what Allan is probably showing the community, what the community is showing Allan and the other people that work there is the person of Christ. When you embody Christ, community is created. A community is created. There's something to that. Of course, Jesus is the one creating what we now know, as the body of Christ, the church. And Allan's, organization is not necessarily a church, but is certainly doing kingdom work. And so if you're here with me at the end, I hope that this is encouraging. I think the one thing that we can do with a medium like this that I would encourage you guys to do, it's just if you're here at the end and you followed this conversation and you find it meaningful, just share it with a friend and then go talk more about it. I want these conversations to spread. Joe and Allan had a conversation. You've hung in there as I've kind of tried to build a conversation. Now you can share that with somebody and take this conversation into proximity to another person's life. I think that is a powerful thing. And if anything, again, I'm sitting here kind of just like sitting at my desk, nerding out about Bible stuff, but how am I going to go and live? I think teaching, is one of the gifts maybe that God has given me. So thank you for hanging in there as I attempt to use that gift to build up and edify the church, the community. Again, I think sharing the conversation is part of that. If I could have one wish, it would be that it's something like a podcast like this would really spread into physical space, be part of a conversation at a coffee shop or something like that, where we are, like I said with Allan, building community around meaningful things. So thanks for being with me, and I'll catch you in the next one.